to everyone on both sides of the Atlantic. Welcome to Carbon Gap's webinar on a transatlantic dialogue, which is titled Carbon Removal Policy in the EU and USA. My name is Eve Damme. I'm a climate policy expert. I run Climate Principles, which is a climate policy advisory. And full disclosure, I also serve on the advisory board of Carbon Gap. I will keep my opening remarks on a more general level, so not to steal the thunder of our amazing panel. The role of carbon removal is better and better understood, and that's a great thing. By now, policymakers have internalized that net zero targets are not possible without removals. But however, this hasn't translated into national carbon removal targets across the board, because as we know, having separate targets for emission reductions and carbon removal is a way to solve for this situation where removals might be deployed not in addition to reductions, but instead of reductions. So if you have separate targets, you can be sure that both parts happen, emissions are reduced, and next to it and in addition to it, removals are scaled. As a little disclaimer, today the discussion focuses narrowly on removals, but that's of course just part of the climate change mitigation. And we're having this discussion in the context where we acknowledge that immediate and deep emission reductions are needed first and foremost to have even a chance to at least try to achieve the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And then next to those emission reductions, we also do need to scale up removal so that we have them ready at the scale needed when we need to have removals ready at a higher scale. It's also common knowledge that meeting the Paris Agreement temperature goal is a challenge. Hence, we should have serious discussions around who is responsible for that possible overshoot if it were to happen, and how to balance it out, again, where removals will come to play. And overall, how this global net negative greenhouse gas emissions economy should emerge within the next 3 decades. This is actually very close, because if you look how far 2050 is from us now, then if you look backwards the same amount of years, we would be in 1998, and that is actually not that long ago. So there's not that much time ahead. And as we know, creating a business case for scaling this wide range of carbon removal methods remains a challenge. Carbon markets, specifically the voluntary carbon markets, so far has been most well known as a funding source for at least market-based funding source for the wider range of CDR methods. But this is way too small scale to have removals at the extent needed. So we need to make use of markets more broadly. And we also need to make use of everything else. And we will hear a lot about other solutions than market-based solutions today as well. Hence, we do need strong policy support to expand this ecosystem of removal activities. And to date, Europe and US have taken very different approaches in their carbon removal policy tools. So I will not be summarizing these myself, because we have a brilliant panel here to do it for us. But we did see many new developments last year in 2023. I think some of these developments started already back in 2022. The government procurement and tax credits in the US, and the carbon removal certification framework proposal, and discussions in the EU. So 2024 is poised to be the biggest year for removals yet. It's also an election year on both sides of the Atlantic. We are having the European elections here, and there will be a presidential elections in the US, and both can have impacts on what policy tools will be in place for removals. So let's hear from both sides of the Atlantic about their plans. I will quickly introduce the panel, but I will just mention the name and affiliation. I will trust that as I give word to our panelists, they will use the first two sentences to introduce themselves in a way they think is the best fit for this session, and then we go into the discussion. So we have with us Robert Jacobson, CDR lead at the U.S. Department of Energy. We have Gianna Amador, who is Executive Director at Carbon Removal Alliance. We have Mark Preston Aragones, who is Policy Manager at Bellona Europe. And last and definitely not least, we have Christian Holzleitner, who is the Head of Unit of Land Economy and Carbon Removals in the European Commission's DG Klima. So amazing group of people to get all these insights on. I suggest we get started first with Europe, and I think I will, in both cases, start with the policymaker. So in this case, with Christian. And could you take the next few minutes to walk us through what initiatives are coming up in 2024 for removals that you can share with us? Over to you, Christian.
Hi, Eva. Thanks so much for the introduction. Good afternoon, all, or good morning for the ones in the US. Very happy to talk a bit of what we are doing here in Brussels. So currently, we're very busy with monitoring, reporting, verification. So we are currently finishing our framework for the certification of carbon removals and carbon farming with the European Council and the European Parliament. So we expect within the next weeks that we have an agreement on that framework. It's a voluntary framework for the certification of carbon removals, but also emission reductions in agriculture. So we are looking at the full range of carbon removals, and we need every type of carbon removal to reach our 2050 target of climate neutrality in Europe. So under this framework, we look into permanent carbon storage, so geologic, but also biochar products, like for example, what you could do with cement, permanently chemically bound products. We look what we can do with more short-term storage in products, so in long-lasting products. For example, something where there's quite an interest across Europe is with wooden buildings. So there you would have storage opportunities for maybe 50, 100 years. And then we look into our soils, into our forests, what we call carbon farming. And there we look at the additional storage that we could generate in soils, in forests, but also at emission reductions that we could have from the rewetting of peatlands, that we could have from more efficient use of fertilizers, for example. And the challenge here is that we really develop reliable monitoring certification methodology so that we can say how much carbon is stored for how long, and very importantly, how sustainably. In particular, for everything related to the bioeconomy, we have both from our member states, but also from our parliament, quite some requests that we should also take into account biodiversity, so the sustainability, not having like just a single-minded focus on removals, but also taking into account, okay, what are the bigger impacts? And if we succeed to conclude the framework in the next weeks, we want to go ahead quite quickly to develop the concrete methodologies, working together with the expert group that we have set up for that purpose, and also depending on the input we get from our experts from the sector, we are ready to go quite quickly in the development of the methodologies. Of course, we want to privilege those on which we have more knowledge, which are more mature from the methodological side, but also those ones that have the bigger potential for climate mitigation but also for the sustainability, for the biodiversity, and so on. So we'll get ready to generate those certificates. And what everyone is asking, okay, well, what do we want to do in the end with these certificates? And we'll get there. And I think there are important developments on our post-2030 climate policy. And we'll start also next month with coming out with our communication on our 2040 climate ambition. So where do we want to be in 2040? You may have already heard, there's been a lot of discussion in Brussels whether we should aim for 2040 to go at least for a net reduction of 90%, which would involve a significant volume of removals from all types. At the same time, we will also come out with a communication on industrial carbon management that will also give a perspective on this new carbon market that we will see in 2040. So where it's on the one hand on, okay, from where will we capture carbon, fossil, non-fossil, fossil carbon, what we will do with this carbon. So will we use it as a removal for storage? Will we make products out of it, like for the chemical sectors? We'll also need a part of that carbon for the e-fuel. So how will that common infrastructure look like for the transport, the use, the storage of that carbon? So for me, that's a very essential question. We need to get clear that the carbon that we capture, we can do two things. We can use it, we can store it. We need to get clear how much do we want to do for what. And this is an important point of this industrial carbon management communication, diving into this question, okay, how can we finance the infrastructure that we need for both? How do we get the right incentives for removals, for use of carbon? What would be the financial support that we need? Well, we have very different types of carbon removals that need like really a tailor-made financing. I've already seen a comment in the chat about blue carbon. Blue carbon will need is at a very different level in its development than, for example, bioenergy with CCS. We need to cover and cater for all of them. We need to have a funding, a research strategy for more early stage carbon removals, and we need to think about, okay, what is the scale up for the more mature carbon removal? So this debate will be opened with these two communications, the 2040 communication, the industrial carbon management, and then we go into the election, we go into the new commission, and then we'll see what is the work program of the new commission. It will definitely include the review of our emission trading system. It will consider whether it's a good idea to include direct air capture with CCS, bioenergy with CCS, or other types of permanent carbon removals into the ETS. It will consider what do we do on the land side. How do we change our current regulations for incentives in the farming sector, in the agri-food value chain, what we often call here carbon farming. So there's a lot of interesting discussion coming up here in Brussels. I'll leave it at that. Over to you, Eve.
Thank you, Christian. Well, this was a lot happening, but of course it's not surprising because in this space there is a lot happening. So I'll move over to Mark, and maybe you can, as Christian covered quite a lot on EU level, feel free to add to that. But then also maybe highlight some of the key developments on the leading member state policies that might be good ones to point out to kick off this discussion. Please, Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you also, Christian, for the very good summary of what's currently going on. the discussion on carbon dioxide removal is, I think, as ever, quite well described, much needed, and happens in a context where we've failed to cut emissions to the extent that we need. I think that's quite important to emphasize. And of course, the EU is doing quite a lot there, as we've heard from Christian. The EU often gets quite a lot of pressure to do more on removals, which I think to an extent is justified. But I think it's also important to remember that the EU is sort of a supranational entity which represents the member states, and a lot of the work will actually need to be done by the member states. So a lot of the work that is happening at the EU level at the moment, these discussions on 2040 targets and the carbon removal certification framework, those are sort of overarching policies that are effectively there to help the member states to be able to get the ball rolling on carbon dioxide removal. And in that context, I think that a lot of the attention should be turning more towards what the member states themselves are doing, which has often been quite lackluster. There was a very good assessment done by Ecologic last year, or a couple of years ago actually, looking at the country's long-term strategies and their national energy and climate plans, which are EU lingo for member state plans for the coming years on climate and energy, to really sort of have an understanding of what their long-term strategies are on removals. And unfortunately, the outcome of that assessment was that there is quite a lot of confusion still on what carbon dioxide removal actually entails, on what its purpose is intended to be, and where exactly countries are able to have an influence in getting the ball rolling there. And that's quite disappointing to hear. There's obviously been a lot of progress, but it really flags the issue that we need to be much better at establishing underlying climate policy frameworks at the national level as well, which clarify what a removal is, what the role of the removal will be in the long term, etc. And there are examples to draw from. So we've seen that Sweden was one of the first movers in this regard to recognize the role of removals, like a supplementary role for removals in their climate plans, that they should reduce emissions by a certain percentage, and any removals that they're able to deploy will necessarily sit on top of those activities to very much sort of accelerate their climate impact, rather than potentially deter it or running to standstill kind of approach. And we've seen some other countries start to replicate this. So in Portugal as well, for example, they've set separate targets for carbon dioxide removal. And this idea is starting to proliferate. Germany, in their climate law, they have a separate contribution from the land sink, and they're discussing separate contributions from industrial carbon removals. And more broadly, we're also seeing countries starting to engage much more on CCUS, so carbon capture and utilization and carbon capture and storage, but applying this concept more broadly to also include carbon dioxide removal. So we've seen France lately announcing the announcement of a CCUS strategy that obviously has a component of bio-CCS in there, and direct air capture to a very limited extent. Germany, as I mentioned as well, working on a carbon management strategy. And next year as well, we'll be looking at residual emissions, which is ultimately what carbon dioxide removal is intended for, to counterbalance those emissions that we really don't know how to get rid of effectively. Back to Sweden, they announced a few years ago they were going to work on some reverse auctions, which have been held back by some state aid difficulties. But those are still in the pipeline, and should be able to incentivize, to provide subsidies to some bio-CCS projects in Sweden in a way which can be quite cost effective. And of course, we've also heard about the big project in Denmark that received a lot of public subsidies to put CCS on a bioenergy installation. So there is some movement in the right direction to try and get the ball rolling, at least in terms of trying to plan. And these efforts tend to be done more in the context of industrial decarbonization. What kind of efforts do we need to be doing in terms of capturing CO2 from industrial installations, reducing emissions, but also trying to see how we can leverage that to also increase removals. But ultimately, what also needs to happen, and this can also happen in parallel, of course, is this discussion of what is the contribution of removals to each individual country's long-term climate plans? How much is each country expecting to have residual emissions by the time we reach our net zero targets? And by definition, then how many removals will we need to be able to counterbalance those residual emissions? And within the EU, where we have the European climate law that sets this target for climate neutrality by 2050, there will be a need to discuss how we're going to balance emissions from maybe some early movers and some late bloomers, perhaps, on how we're going to try to find this balance between emissions and removals at the European level, knowing that that discussion will obviously be replicated also at the global level, where it could potentially also become quite an interesting discussion. But yeah, so that's, I think, a good summary so far of what's been going on, what I think needs to happen in the coming months and years. Really, we need to be focusing quite a bit on the long-term contribution from removals as well. Thanks, Eve.
Thanks so much, Mark. Again, plenty happening on member state level, but a lot could be better. I do know that whilst from the European perspective, it can seem like so much is happening in Europe, but at the same time, in the US, it sometimes feels like even more is happening there, or at least what is happening on a larger scale. But before I turn to our US colleagues, I'm going to voice a plea from the organizers. If all the panelists could please keep their videos on to make our webinar a bit more interactive and seeing the faces, that would be much appreciated. So having said this, moving over to our US colleagues, I will get started with Rory. If you could share us more about national level policy initiatives that you are expecting to come up for carbon removal in 2024. So, Rory, over to you. I see that Rory is still muted and there's no video. So maybe while Rory is getting ready, I will instead start with Gianna, because I see that she's ready and she's nodding. So in that case, we will start more with the state level initiatives. And Gianna, yes, please share what 2024 has in store for us.
Yeah, happy to. And I think Rory was having some technical difficulties with his Wi-Fi, so hopefully those will be cleared up by the time I'm done speaking. But hi, everyone. I'm Gianna Amador. I'm the Executive Director at the Carbon Removal Alliance. We are a new organization that's working to bridge the gap between the carbon removal private sector and U.S. federal policymakers. Right now, we work with over 25 carbon removal companies who are all united by a commitment to permanent high-quality carbon removal and are working to develop technologies across the full suite of carbon removal solution, from things like bikers to direct air capture to ocean-based carbon removal to enhanced rock weathering. And our job is to translate the challenges that entrepreneurs are facing into really smart policies. I wanted to kick off a little bit today just to talk about the history of carbon removal policy in the US. And that is something that really, I mean, it has been happening since 2016, but really, I think, took off in 2018. The United States in particular, when we think about their sort of strength and focus and climate generally, it really comes down to technology development. That's something that we saw with renewable energy, with electric vehicles, and we see a very similar playbook applied to carbon removal solutions as well. There are a couple policies that I wanted to highlight that have been passed in the last few years. 4 policies in particular. One, the US federal government has about $150 million per year allocated to research, development, and demonstration at the Department of Energy. Again, this is across the full suite of carbon removal solutions. There was also in the bipartisan infrastructure law, $3.5 billion that was passed to create 4 regional direct air capture hubs that would each capture 1 million tons of CO2. This was a pretty landmark policy considering most direct air capture companies at this moment are capturing in the tens of thousands of tons of CO2. So this is really an opportunity for us to scale those projects to a really climate significant scale. There's also the 45Q tax credit, which I know has been mentioned already on this call, but this tax credit in particular would provide $180 per ton of CO2 for direct air capture plus storage. So this is one of the sort of major incentives and market creating policies that really help drive carbon removal deployment to date. And then finally, I wanted to flag a new carbon removal purchasing program that has been launched by the Department of Energy that would directly procure carbon removal. And I'm sure Roy will have a lot more to say about that. I think all of these policies together have created a real uptick in the maturity and scale of the carbon removal field. I think just over the past few years, we've really seen a huge increase in the maturity of technologies. We've seen pretty significant cost decline for technologies like direct air capture, and we've also seen a large influx in the number of carbon removal companies and the diversity of technologies that are being developed. So I think a really great signal towards the impact of these policies. We're also still very much in the implementation phase for many of these, so it will take a few years for us to really understand their full benefits and costs. I think I also wanted to talk a little bit about what policies is it going to take for us to move from this sort of early stage of technology development to that gigaton scale carbon removal. I think there are 3 really big policy gaps that the US can work on in the coming years. I think one is around demonstration. Getting more projects on the ground is going to be absolutely critical to technology development and bringing down costs, as well as proving the monitoring, reporting, and verification around a full suite of nascent carbon removal solutions, but will also give us really important information around what are the economic and community benefits that come with carbon removal solutions, and how do we appropriately engage communities where these projects are being built and make sure that they have autonomy and decision-making authority over how these projects are built within their community. The second and probably the largest and most important in my book is market development. I think one of the things that makes carbon removal solutions unique from other climate technologies like renewable energy is that they don't have a pre-existing market to sell into. And right now, voluntary carbon offset markets often either sell credits at too low or are just, from a scale perspective, insufficient to provide an adequate lever or source of revenue for the carbon removal company. So we really need markets much sooner than I think most people realize. So I think in the US in particular, in the coming years, a lot of folks are focused on expanding the 45Q tax credit to apply to a broader suite of carbon removal solutions beyond direct air capture, and also scaling the carbon removal purchasing program at the Department of Energy. And then the last thing I'll say is that we absolutely need a regulatory and permitting regime that is really fit for purpose for carbon removal solutions so that we can make sure that projects are built responsibly and safely in communities across the US. So I think generally we've made a lot of good progress. I think we've seen a lot of strides on the technology development front, and we're sort of at this exciting moment where carbon removal solutions are moving from the lab into the real world, and we're able to sort of test these things at more climate significant scales. I think in order to get to that next generation of policies, we really need to build bipartisan political will in the US, and of course, a lot of our ability to pass some of these policies, or the types of policies that we will pass, will be dependent on the outcomes of the 2024 election. But I know lots of organizations are working on getting some of these policies embedded in the congressional plans for the next few years. So I will pause there and looking forward to answering questions.
Thanks so much, Jenna. I think very clear, also very well structured with the key developments and key gaps and what is needed. So thanks for sharing this. So I see we have Rory with us, fully on video and unmuted, so able to engage. Gianna already mentioned something very interesting. DOE is undertaking the CDR purchasing program. I'd be curious to learn what's in store there, and if there are any other initiatives you'd like to highlight that are going to be key for CDR on national level in 2024. Over to you, Rory.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And sorry for the Wi-Fi troubles. We are having quite a storm on the East Coast over here. And so our extreme weather events are getting more persistent, more significant, but really excited to be with you all. And thank you to Carbon Gap for letting me fill in for my supervisor, Noah Deitch. And really excited to have a conversation with you. And Gianna, as a Carbon 180 alum, I'm extremely excited to get to chat with Gianna again and share sort of how Department of Energy on this side of the Atlantic is thinking about carbon removal policy. And so I'm very excited to talk about our CDR purchasing effort, but I sort of want to start where Mark did, which is, what is the long-term strategy here? So if we look at this administration's long-term strategy for getting to our Paris Agreement commitments, there is a lever that is technological CDR. And I think that gap is still sort of to be determined. There are a number of different technologies that can fill in, but the bottom line, I think, to Gianna's point, is that we have to do a lot of research, development, demonstration in the near term to understand what the economics of these technologies are likely to be, and also to understand where our investments are most effectively placed across a wide portfolio of CDR pathways. And so I'll get into some of the pieces that we're doing on that. A couple of, I think, disclaimers. I'll speak to specifically the Department of Energy's perspective on these topics. I don't claim to represent the entire US government, but we'll certainly speak to the efforts that Department of Energy has engaged in. I'm going to presume, having looked at the folks that are online today, that we're largely familiar with regional DAC hubs, largely familiar with some of the US tax credits. And so instead of focusing on, I think, some of the bigger pieces, I'm actually going to talk about some of the initiatives that are less discussed, I think, in the international policy dialogue that I think that Department of Energy and this administration should be very proud of. I want to start with, I think, the piece around community benefits that Gianna mentioned, talking about specifically in the infrastructure law. There are many programs that the Biden-Harris administration is implementing that require that at least 40% of those benefits go to disadvantaged communities. And many of our CDR programs, including the regional DAC hubs, are Justice 40 programs and include a community benefits plan that has to be negotiated with that host community. In alignment with that, we also saw, I think, a really important gap around projects that the Department of Energy is not funding that are also carbon removal projects that will have impacts on communities, both positive and potentially some trade-offs around resource allocation. And in response to that, I'm really excited to highlight that we've launched a responsible carbon management initiative that includes an entire variety of principles around how the private sector can be thoughtful and community-oriented, not just in ecosystem services and benefits, but in workforce development and in environmental justice around how we deploy carbon dioxide removal solutions. It includes an entire suite of principles that we've sought public comment on, including air and water quality, including community engagement, thinking about workforce development, economic development. And so now that we've gotten feedback on that, we will issue final guidance around what that looks like and how we expect the private sector to engage with us on those principles moving forward, which I think is just a very exciting opportunity for project developers looking to develop CDR projects in the US to, one, engage with DOE, but also to engage with their host communities around what benefits should and could look like. I also want to highlight, I think that Christian pointed to the importance of measurement, reporting, and verification. This will continue to be a very important effort for Department of Energy. We've allocated to date, I believe, $20 million in FY or financial year 2023 to 6 different projects within our national labs. And most of these are, I think, fundamental science and research efforts around understanding the supply chains, life cycle assessments, and technoeconomics, and of course, long-term storage, durability, or permanence of different carbon dioxide removal pathways. I think of this less as a certification framework within the US for regulatory purposes and much more a research and development initiative to inform private sector standard development and methodology development. I also saw a question in the chat around marine carbon dioxide removal. I think this is an important topic that the Department of Energy is very excited to collaborate on, specifically with our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Their ocean acidification program has been extremely strong in leading on this topic and has developed strong guidance around how the US could or should engage on carbon dioxide removal in marine environments, thinking about the London Convention, the London Protocol, and how the US can best align with the policy environment around regulations, international governance, and responsibly do research and development without causing harm to our ecosystems or coastal communities. I'll say that DOE has invested in a number of sort of early technology readiness level projects specifically around direct ocean capture and intends to continue thinking about this initiative. We've also engaged in measurement, reporting, and verification for blue carbon ecosystems. Two big pieces that I sort of want to close out on. I think that this year, 2024, will be a year of pilots and demonstrations for Department of Energy that I'm very excited about. We put out a notice of intent earlier this year around funding for 1,000 to 5,000 ton per annum CDR pilots for bikers, biomass carbon removal with storage, enhanced rock weathering and mineralization, and multi-CDR pathway test beds. So integrating different CDR pathways within the same ecosystem or context. And we're very excited to sort of understand this key gap in scaling up. I think to Gianna's point, there's this important commercialization gap between becoming a direct air capture hub at sort of the 1 million ton level and the lab scale experiments that we're seeing today. Finally, I do want to close on, I think, a really exciting initiative that DOE has undertaken, which is the CDR Purchase Pilot Prize. This is a first of a kind effort for the Department of Energy to actually purchase durable, long-term, permanent CDR credits from CDR suppliers within the US. I think this is an important experiment for DOE to understand how market mechanisms can be a driver in scaling up CDR, but also in understanding where the market is today and what additional support is needed with respect to research, development, demonstration to get these technologies to market. And then finally, of course, encouraging the private sector and CDR buyers to follow our lead and to do diligence, but also to co-purchase with us. And so I'm happy to share some of those documents in the chat, but I've been talking for a minute here, so I will pass it back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rory. It's amazing to hear the overview of what is happening in the EU and what is happening in the US, because if we listen to it, the developments, they are quite different. And as we are having this transatlantic conversation, I would like to explore, now that you have both also heard what is happening on the other side of the pond, is there anything that's caught your eye or your ear in terms of what policy tools is either already established or being considered that you think could also be beneficial in your own jurisdiction? I think I will maybe turn back to the European colleagues. Let's see if there's I see Christian might be a volunteer because he is unmuted. So Christian, what's from the US is something that the EU could take and learn from and implement?
No, I would be very interested to learn more about the purchasing program. So this seems to be, for me, quite an effective way how to fund carbon removals. But as I said before, what I would be particularly interested in is how can you do it such that you serve both more the early stage carbon removals as well as the ones who are already more mature. So how do we find the right balance to support both the scale up of the more mature solutions as well as supporting more the early stage ones like blue carbon and others, because just putting them all in the same pot where you have very different costs per ton of carbon, thinking about biochar, direct air capture CCS or others, will probably be not the most effective funding instrument.
Thanks, Christian. Are there any immediate reactions to, because that was a very specific question, And yeah, I think Rory probably has been doing some thinking around it. So what would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, it keeps me up at night for sure. So I'll start by saying I think this is a pilot program intentionally, right? We are attempting to understand how to purchase the highest quality durable CDR. And so the entire prize that we will run over the course of several years will be a $35 million USD investment, which is, relatively small dollars compared to things like the Frontier initiative that we've seen with, close to $1 billion of capital and deployment committed. I don't think that necessarily all CDR solutions should be considered ready for purchase today. I think that's why I sort of closed with this idea that there are sort of pilots for those CDR solutions that might not be ready to deliver durable, robust, well-measured, reported, verified credits to the market today. Those are still solutions that we think are important for our long-term strategy, and we'll continue to support with cooperative agreements, which is basically just a grant. That's how DOE supports earlier stage projects. I think that part of the pilot purchasing effort is understanding what credits are ready to go to market today, have long-term durability considerations, have really robust measurement, reporting, and verification, are aligned with the department standards for high quality CDR from a community engagement and an environmental justice perspective. And I think, there will be a limited number of solutions that can deliver today. We had 4 different areas of interest, including direct air capture, bikers or biomass carbon removal with storage, and enhanced rock weathering. And then a 4th topic area that was sort of any intervention in the upper hydrosphere and terrestrial ecosystems that could commit to geologic storage or equivalent. We're putting, I think, a lot of the accountability on the private sector CDR suppliers to demonstrate what that should look like. Jen, I don't know if you want to add to that from your standpoint.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I think there's like a fine balance here that the purchasing program needs to walk. I think right now for the relative stage of carbon removal technologies in particular, so not focusing on more land-based solutions like traditional forestry or soil carbon sequestration, there's a lot of private sector investment that government purchasing can drive. So even the existence of this purchasing program has actually unlocked a lot of private sector research development and demonstration funding. So I think that in itself is really powerful. So even without having a much higher price tag, we're seeing this program have ripple effects. I think it's important for us to think of this purchasing prize as an innovation lever as opposed to a scale lever, just because we're going to need to get to 10 gigatons down the line. And we know that no single carbon removal solution can get us there. And because of that, we really need to invest in a portfolio approach now. I don't think we should we shouldn't use the purchasing prize to purchase things that are super small or still lab scale, but I think there's some amount of risk that needs to be incorporated into this purchasing prize, knowing that some of these tons or some of these companies might not actually be able to deliver the tons, and that's okay. I think that means the government doesn't have to pay for them, but inherently, I think taking that risk will allow us to support a much more diverse set of carbon removal solutions that will ultimately give us a better path towards that 10 gigaton number, as opposed to if the federal government today were just to buy like all direct air capture tons. I think that might just end up being a little bit short-sighted. And I'm recognizing that I'm in a very comfortable position of not being sort of accountable for how these funds are used. But I think procurement as a lever for innovation, I think is the frame that is most impactful for getting projects on the ground today.
Thanks both. I think it was great to hear some more specifics. I do find that the design of this purchasing prize is amazing in the way that it crowds in the private sector investment. That is not just government putting its own money on the table. I intend to go through all speakers with the same question that Christian already answered. So put yourself ready. I'll probably move on to Mark. So what would you take over from the US and implement in Europe?
And I really like the procurement. I find that that's something that the EU can that is geared up to be able to take on, because I think there's quite a lot that can be done there, and I think it also can have a big effect on emission reductions at the same time. I think it's one of those measures that could have a double effect. And those are the types of measures that I like to push forward first, the ones that can really have an effect on both emission reductions and removals at the same time. And there's a lot to be done there on public procurement. The way that that's done at the moment is tends to result in a lot of emissions. And if we can find a way to, at the same time, minimize the emissions from public procurement and drive, sort of provide a really nice carrot to reduction, to removal activities, I think that's excellent. And at the same time, I find that it can also get around some of the discussions that we often get bogged down on when it comes to credits and everything, where if we get bogged down in the discussion of generating a credit and then someone has to buy that credit so that they can make a claim, etc. With the procurement, I think that's a good sort of short-term initial way to get that get that carrot going without all of the risks that are attached to the current way of relying on voluntary carbon markets and carbon credits. So I think that for me is the biggest measure from the US I'd be very happy to see replicated in the EU.
Thanks, Mark. So it looks like we have a winner on the US side that's that creates the most attraction. So let's look at things from the other way around. So from the US perspective, if you look at what's happening in Europe, what do you see that you think could also be beneficial to be used in the US? I'll start with Rory.
Yeah, I think, first of all, a compliance market would be great for CDR. But sort of like taking away my magic fairy wand, I think that certification is a really important aspect that a DOE has intentionally not necessarily approached directly. We've thought very rigorously about measurement, reporting, and verification, life cycle accounting for different CDR pathways, and intend to continue issuing guidance on best practices of how to do this. We have not issued certification guidance or any sort of regulatory guidance around what this should look like, other than on direct air capture, which is within Environmental Protection Agency's jurisdiction and is actually accounted for in our inventory. I think the other piece is just how negative emissions fit within a national inventory more broadly. So in the US, we have net zero targets. I think it's really important to think about the independent role of negative emissions outside of, or in addition to, I guess I should say, emissions reductions. And so talking to Mark's, sort of first point at the very beginning of the webinar, DOE views emissions reductions as the first priority, right? So decarbonizing every possible sector that we can and seeing carbon removal as a really important stopgap measure to remove all of the legacy emissions and counterbalance those sectors that we can decarbonize. And so without intention of sort of copying out of the question, I think that certification is extremely important. I also think considering where those certifications fit within a broader emissions reductions and removals context in a national inventory is also very important.
Great, thanks for that. And I think it will be difficult to find a serious stakeholder in this space who would say that they don't think emission reductions are first and foremost, but then removals play an important role next to it. Well, Gianna, what would you take from Europe's activities so far?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in, and maybe I will pretend that I have a magic wand, as Rory said. But I think compliance markets in particular are really interesting and exciting way to build those markets that I talked about in my initial remarks. Obviously, I think the US federal government is, I would say, less favorable to traditional compliance markets or things like a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. And so that poses a challenge without an overarching system to see the US plug carbon removal into a compliance market. But I think one of the exciting things about the US that we haven't yet talked about is that states on their own are often pursuing really progressive climate policy, and states are often used as laboratories for policies that then get laddered up to the federal government. We've seen one state, for example, California, introduce a bill called, the bill number is SB 308, but it would essentially require emitters who are currently covered under the California cap and trade to remove a percentage of their emissions that ramps up over time. And so I do think there's a lot that states can learn, states who have their own compliance markets, states who are interested in scaling or building compliance markets from scratch, a lot of things that those states can learn from the European context, along a lot of what Rory said in terms of the same lines around certification and making sure that we have strong both guidelines around how emissions should be used, and also how do we really quantify the carbon that's being removed and compare them in a way that feels representative and in line with their role in our broader climate strategy.
Yeah, thanks for that. And indeed, I mean, the US doesn't have a national compliance market, but you do have state level compliance markets. So, and I know in the past there have been some discussions even between linking some of these markets with the EU ETS. So there's a history there, but I think the idea of having worldwide linked compliance markets didn't materialize, and I think now it's less and less likely to happen in practice. I mentioned elections in the very beginning in the introductions because it was a point we wanted to cover before we get to the general Q&A. Although I saw some questions already pop up in the Q&A that also are tackling this question. Maybe starting with Europe, to give time to breathe to Gianna and Rory. What is your expectation? The European elections that are coming up, what is the possible impact on the CDR policy, or is there a possible serious impact on the CDR policy in Europe? And if yes, then what it could be? Of course, it's guessing, but you might have some things you would like to share on this front. Maybe starting with Mark.
It's a difficult question. I think the EU is set up in such a way where, well, obviously the Council holds quite a lot of the sway. So the European elections will mostly change the European Parliament. And it's quite likely, well, I don't know how likely, but there's a chance that it will swing towards less climate progressive Parliament. And it'll also change the priorities of the Commission, but it's not likely necessarily to change that much. There's a lot of stuff that's already in motion, and I think it would be quite difficult to stop those things. So it really depends on how the next Commission comes in and what their work plan is, as Christian mentioned at the beginning. I wouldn't expect there to be such a major shift unless we see a huge signal from the elections that there is, opposition to climate action, which would be hugely disappointing, of course. But that's obviously a possibility. Even if that were to happen, I think it's quite difficult to deny the fact that there's a need to do much more, even than what the Commission has already done. So it could put us in a very difficult position. And I don't think it's possible to narrow this topic, this sort of question, down specifically to CDR. I think it's a much, it's broader. It involves climate policy more broadly. But I would expect the conversation, if we do end up in a place where there's more climate skeptics in the Parliament than there were before, I would expect the conversation perhaps to switch towards climate adaptation or other measures which are less focused on mitigation. And to be honest, I think that there is a need to work a lot more on climate adaptation at the EU level as well. So yeah, not really clear on what the next European cycle will look like, but hopefully we get a signal from the European population that we want more climate action, not less.
Optimistic viewpoints, at least the end of it. Christian, is there anything you'd like to add? I know that you're in a slightly different position and probably can share a bit less, but anything?
No, but I think our objective is very clear: climate neutrality by 2050. This is set in stone, and I think also as the latest political discussions have shown, I think there's quite an agreement that we would go for at least 90% net reduction by 2040. But there are some key decisions for the next Commission coming up. So the next Commission will decide for the EU budget over the next 7 years, so reaching well into the 2030s, which is very important for agriculture, as this is a large part of what we are financing from the EU budget. But there's also a big question how we will address all the clean tech challenges that we have. What is the investment agenda? Overall, I mean, how much of the future EU budget will go to the climate agenda, to the competitiveness agenda, and so on. So I think it goes very much beyond climate. This is a question of competitiveness. This is a question of energy independence. It's about food security. I think also the next Commission will be a very geopolitical one. So this goes much broader, and it's about how do we finance these investments that we need for getting to climate neutrality, which is a huge economic stimulus. But we need to find a way how to find the right balance between what we can do with the next budget of the Commission. What can the European Investment Bank do? How can we leverage all those investments? How can we leverage all the private investments? Because we are also doing a lot with the taxonomy and so on. If you think also what we're doing with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive on the climate reporting for undertakings. So there's a lot going on. It's really, I think the next Commission will be very much about an investment agenda.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks for sharing this. So picking up what Christian said, that the 2050 target is set in stone. If we turn to the US, is the 45Q tax credit set in stone? What could potentially change if depending on the results of the presidential elections? Who would like to start? Gianna, please.
Yeah, to chime in first. I think obviously the election, I think in the House, Senate, and the presidential election will have implications for the scale of carbon removal investment and the type of carbon removal investment. I think there are many scenarios that we could play out, but I think one important thing to draw attention to is that many of the carbon removal policies that have passed to date have had bipartisan support, so both Republican and Democrat support. And I think that provides a really powerful signal that carbon removal is maybe not yet, or is not polarized in the same way that other climate technologies are, and has really enjoyed this bipartisan support. So all of the policies that I mentioned before, the $3.5 billion for the direct air capture hubs, the $150 million for research, development, and demonstration, the purchasing program, all of those were passed with bipartisan support. And so I am confident that we'll be able to continue to move carbon removal policies no matter the outcome of the election. I think what will be important as we're moving away from talking about, innovation, research, more innovation, to thinking about deployment, it's really important for us to think about our messaging and really be focusing our efforts from the civil society perspective, so from NGOs who are working on policy, to really build that bipartisan political will. And I think that will pay dividends in the long run. I think part of that work is making sure that we're telling a story about industry creation and some of the things that Christian mentioned around energy security, national competitiveness, jobs, community benefits, and the more carbon removal projects that we have on the ground, and the more carbon removal projects that we can point to, the more constituents that benefit from these projects, I think the stronger the case that we have for, bipartisan action and bipartisan champions on carbon removal. So I won't try to, guess the outcomes of the election, but I think we need, as a community, to build a strategy that allows us to function within any political climate. Right. I don't know if there's anything you want to add as well.
No, I think I would echo everything that you said. And I think to your point, durable strategy for both policy strategy, but also carbon removal solutions, very important. And I think that we've seen strong supports for carbon dioxide removal from both sides of the aisle. And that includes direct air capture, but it also includes biomass, carbon removal with sequestration or storage, or BECCS. We've also seen support for a wide variety of natural climate solutions. So I think that support for carbon dioxide removal is durable. And I think that one of the key pieces that Department of Energy is trying to do is track the impact, yes, in terms of emissions, but also in terms of workforce development, economic development, and social impact that we're seeing as a result of some of these policies. And so I think, yes, measuring the emissions benefit of CDR is crucial, but also continuing to account for some of the other social benefits of these policies is going to be very important for continuing to make a positive case for carbon dioxide removal investment.
Thanks so much. I loved the sentence where it said the support for CDR is durable. I think that's what the CDR experts like to hear, right? This is the moment to move on to the Q&A with our audience. I think we will have Clotilde from Carbon Gap to choose. I'm not sure if these questions, they haven't been upvoted, right? There is no option for that. So Clotilde, what have you chosen for us?
Indeed, it's all a matter of having to give everyone as much time as they can get. I know that Caroline's question was really interesting. Caroline was asking, as we start to scale carbon removal markets, should we think of carbon removal more as a public utility or a private good? I'm very interested to know what each speaker has to say, and from their perspective, I believe their answer might be very different.
A public utility or a private good? It really depends on from which perspective you're looking at it, right? Is there anyone who'd like to volunteer? I'm also mindful that if we do the full round of speakers per question, we will not get through that many questions. Maybe we'll add another question to it, and then we can maybe something general as well. So there's more to cover in the responses. Or if not, I'll just take a volunteer. Who has thoughts? Mark has thoughts, please,
Yeah,
Mark.
very happy to engage on that. I think that's a really good question and timely question as well. I think going back to the beginning of this conversation, of this session, talking about the role of removals, and also the way that Rory described the DOE's understanding of needing to cut emissions as the priority, and then removals being there for historical emissions and for residual emissions. I think it's quite important to make sure that whenever we deploy removals, that they are used in such a way as to maximize the public good, and that makes it very difficult for it to be managed as a private good. The carbon market approach, I think, works quite well if we want to sort of generate funding for those activities, and economists love it because it's optimal. But at the same time, we don't know necessarily if it will achieve the fairest outcome. We don't know if the residual emissions, the residual emitters, for example, will be the ones who will be able to afford the removals, especially at the price points that Christian was mentioning earlier. So we need to find a way to structure the way we incentivize and deploy removals in such a way as to, at the end, we manage to find a balance between removals and emissions. But I'm not confident that that can necessarily be done, at least purely in a market-driven way. And I think there needs to be some kind of public good understanding in terms of how carbon dioxide removal will need to be applied. And in this way, we often like to compare it to the sewage system, which is kind of like a underlying infrastructure that we all need as a public good. And in many ways, carbon dioxide removal is the sewage system of the atmosphere, and we need to make sure that it does end up achieving the final goal of helping us reach climate neutrality, rather than just achieving removals for the sake of removals.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your thinking. Would anyone like to add to this?
Yeah, can I
Christian?
challenge there a bit?
Please challenge.
Yes. If you look, for example, at agriculture, we have in Europe, we have the common agricultural policy, but also like in the US, you have a lot of public funding going into agriculture. So the question is, this potential, what is there for removing stirring carbon, should it be financed publicly, or should it be financed within the value chain, so about the final consumers? And there seems to be a willingness to pay, like from the food processors and so on, that want to claim that they have a climate neutral value chain. So what is about the willingness to pay here? And I think that's a question overall for the bioeconomy. If you look into also bioenergy, different forms, biochemicals, and so on, right? There's the option for those companies to claim climate neutrality, or even a climate positive product, a climate positive heat, if you do bioenergy with CCS. So is there a willingness to pay within the value chain that we can realize? So I think it's also a question of like a little bit of fairness or whatever. How do we think about what can be done within the value chain to get into climate positivity? And then there may be other options where to do it publicly. But I think we should also think about what should be done within the value chain, and to which extent can we there give companies an opportunity to sell more sustainable products that may even go beyond climate neutrality.
Great. Any other comments on this? No? Okay, so let's move on. So there's one question. Now I saw the questions that were also selected and shared with me by Clotilde. So sorry there's just confusion, because in some places you have different chats for Q&A and chat, and here is all under one button. I'm still learning how to use Zoom after all these years. Who knew? So there is one question specifically to the US panel. I have to say it is to some extent quite technical, but let's see how it resonates, if you have views on this. So the question is, how do you see the role of the voluntary carbon markets and the development of a derivatives contracts markets for increased liquidity of voluntary carbon credits? So the question is the development of the derivatives contracts markets to increase that liquidity in the VCM. Are there any risks which you see in providing this liquidity? Any reactions to this? Yes, Rory.
So I won't weigh in on the actual question itself, which is a strong maybe from my standpoint at DOE, but I think that ultimately I would look to the Commodity Future Trading Commission's guidance that they recently issued around carbon offset markets, and specifically looking at derivative markets for those commodities. I think it is exciting that the Securities Exchange Commission and the CFTC are taking more of an interest around carbon removal as a commodity and potentially as a regulated commodity, particularly around quality, but also improving market conditions, but don't have a specific comment. I think that question around liquidity.
Thanks. I think it's just also, I'm not sure this question is as spot on for given the people we have in the panel here today, because we don't necessarily have deep carbon market experts here. So there is another kind of, if you look at the questions that come in, one that's kind of comes through is the question around the role of, but yet still talking about markets, the role of compliance markets versus voluntary markets. And it would be interesting to know, in your view, so the potential integration of CDR in compliance regimes, what do you see as the benefits, and what do you think, or whether you think some or part or all of it should be left to the voluntary markets? I guess I know the answer, but as these questions come in, I think it's great to clarify. So CDR in markets, is it better in voluntary and compliance markets or in both?
I'm happy
Yes,
to.
the volunteers can unmute themselves.
Yes.
Indeed, Mark,
Jenna,
go
please.
ahead.
Jenna was,
You can start, and I can chime in after.
okay. So I think in the long term, the voluntary carbon market will necessarily need to kind of die out in a way. I don't think we can really meet our climate targets voluntarily. It's going to have to be done in a bit more sort of expeditious way than that. I think the question is probably also somewhat geared towards the question of the ETS as well. And I think it's quite clear that the ETS is doing quite a good job at the moment in reducing emissions. And it might have a role in generating finance towards carbon dioxide removal projects, as it currently does with the Innovation Fund. However, this question of integrating removals into the same market as emission reductions, I think, is much more complicated than it seems at face value. And even though the ETS will, and compliance markets will necessarily reach a point where we get to very, very difficult, very expensive emissions, we need to find a way to make sure that there is an amount of removals that can counterbalance those. But I wouldn't say those necessarily need to be put in that market. And at the same time, I really don't expect the voluntary markets to be able to meet those price points either. So the voluntary market between now and in this decade, I think potentially can have a role in trying to spur innovation. But it often ends up in these conversations of being able to make claims of carbon neutrality, and those can often end up being very misleading, and in many ways have actually detracted the attention from where we need to be spending most of our efforts. So the voluntary carbon market discussion is quite fraught. I think we need to start focusing much more on the compliance side of things, not necessarily from the ETS. I think there needs to be a way for it to interact with the ETS in the longer run, but we need to work on two separate systems for reductions and removals. Would be my answer there.
Thanks, Mark. Very, very clear views. Yeah, Gianna, over to you.
I'll just add on to that. I agree that I think the voluntary carbon market has faced a number of challenges, even with just traditional offsets around the quality of credits, the ability for companies to make net neutral or net negative claims, and also I think poses a number of challenges or issues around environmental justice. And I think truthfully, it's difficult for carbon removal companies whose price per ton of carbon is much higher than emissions avoidance or emission reduction offsets to really fully compete in a voluntary carbon market, I think, which makes it an imperfect solution. That being said, I know there is, a series of leading companies from Frontier to Microsoft who are beginning to purchase carbon removal credits through advanced market commitments. And I think that's another way in which we're seeing voluntary action begin to spur carbon removal. I think the truth is, to get to 10 gigatons of carbon removal, we're likely going to need a pretty diverse set of market creating policies. And so in my mind, it's not really an either or, it's what's the sort of like patchwork quilt of policies that we need in order to get to our ultimate carbon removal goals or carbon removal targets. So I think compliance market, the voluntary carbon market, government procurement, other demand pull incentives like tax incentives, all of those things will help us drive more deployment. And I don't think we necessarily need to pit them against each other, especially at this point. I think oftentimes we get stuck in this sort of like policy wonk frame of like, what's the most efficient policy, when policies are usually passed based on politics as opposed to efficiency. And so we should think about what's possible to get passed over the next 25 years to get us to that 10 gigaton per year number by 2050.
Thanks, Gianna. I think it's oftentimes useful, like whatever question comes up, to indeed think about the scale and then kind of narrow it down to, okay, what does it then mean in practice? Anyone from the public sector who would like to chime in on this? Rory?
I mean, maybe I'll just offer a sort of compliment to our EU and UK colleagues and say that I think that thinking about demand side policy or market shaping policy, we've spent a lot of time both communicating with and learning from policy work that's been done on the other side of the Atlantic, whether it's been contracts for differences for electricity or hydrogen, thinking about feed-in tariffs. And so there's been a bunch of demand side and market building work that has already been done that I think the carbon dioxide removal industry can and should learn from. And so at DOE, we've been studying those market models and trying to build out our expertise of how some of these frameworks could or could not apply to carbon dioxide removal. And I think to Gianna's point, all of this does sort of have the caveat of what can be passed in the near term, but I do think there are a lot of lessons to learn from some of these other industries.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rory. I'm looking, Christian is not eager to jump in on this, so I'll move on to next question that is very transatlantic in its formulation. And it is, how can the US and the EU strengthen collaboration and, where relevant, standardization? I see reactions.
I mean, I can start on that piece, actually.
Okay.
I'm excited to chat about this piece. So I think that I mentioned it, I think, in my opening remarks, but mission innovation and the CDR mission specifically is a great piece to do this work on. There's, for folks that have not heard about this mission, I encourage you to look up the website. There's a whole suite of resources, including international research and development roadmaps, and specifically, I think, measurement, reporting, and verification guidance, and basically scope of work or a future work stream that the EU Commission, the United States, and other members have collectively committed to participate in. I think that's a great founding principle and sort of a shared opportunity to have engagement around what CDR best practices for certification could look like. Again, I think it today is more about MRV and less about certification, but I think that's certainly an opportunity for future work streams.
Great. There is indeed a lot happening under the CDR mission of the mission innovation. Any other thoughts, Christian?
Yeah, no, I would love to engage on developing common standards to set up projects on data. We are doing already a lot on international cooperation, not only mission innovation. We have a lot of projects under our Horizon program that are open to international cooperation. Also, now the UK also has joined again, so we can do a lot of things there. And I hope also that the work on Article 6 will progress. I think also what we could do, looking into CORSIA, the aviation industry, which would be like could be a very good market for carbon removals. That would be very good for scaling up and coming back to also the question before, the earlier we can provide more clarity for the different types of carbon removals, how we can support them. And I think this is a challenge compared to hydrogen or other technologies, is because there are so different types of carbon removals with so different costs and potential. But we need to provide for all of them more clarity. How do we take them forward over the next 10, 15 years? Because we need to keep all those great people working there. We need to get to keep them engaged and give them a perspective on how do we take that forward until we'll have more carbon removals that are in an equal cost and price range.
Indeed, thanks for this. Any other reactions, or shall I move on?
Maybe very quickly. Sorry,
Yes.
just on the mission innovation, I think the pilot projects that are mentioned there. So the idea that all of the members will strive towards having some pilot projects. I think that's really key, because this decade, really, where we don't necessarily have these standards and certifications and MRVs and everything, it's still the time to try these different things, and likely fail, but at least learn and not make those mistakes again. So I think that part of the sort of transatlantic cooperation, I think, is very interesting, and should be kept up.
Thanks for that. Now I'm torn. I had two possible questions to go for. I'm gonna go for one of them that has to do with geography, as we have a transatlantic discussion, and it's about checking what is your view on not having a geographical limitation on sourcing removals. That's a topic that comes up every now and then in different policy discussions. I know definitely in the European context quite strongly. And following up from this, the question continues, also potentially integrating the MRV processes from emerging VCM methodologies, so that in order to not to duplicate efforts, and being able to get policies in place faster. But yeah, so the question around not having geographical limitation on sourcing removals. Who'd like to take this first? I mean, Mark is smiling and nodding. I know that you probably have thought about it quite a bit. I'm going to put you on the spot here.
I'm happy to talk about that. Removals, the ability to deploy removals is not equally distributed on the planet for obvious reasons. So I think that to an extent, there will be a need to have that discussion. At the same time, going back to the point I raised about climate neutrality at the EU level, at the moment, the EU climate law specifies that it's a sort of domestic target. So it has to be met with activities that happen inside the Union. And this brings the question of, if a country, perhaps a developing country, has a lot of removal potential, but it's all being bought out by another country that is able to buy those out, and then that country is left without removals to counterbalance its own residual emissions, then I think we end up with a situation which might not actually be favorable. So I think that's a consideration to bear in mind, to make sure that we are developing the CDR in the places where it should and can be developed, but not necessarily sort of co-opting those for the developed countries. So, developed countries should ideally be funding removals in other countries without necessarily taking the credit for them, which is probably not a very popular opinion, but I think that, it might be the fairest way to go about achieving climate neutrality at global level.
Thanks, Mark. Any other views, Jenna?
I'm happy to chime in as well. I think this really is a justice question. And for me, that bears this question of what is the ton being used for? And I know Mark started to talk about this as well. I think if the ton is a compensation claim, so meaning that the ton is used to offset for an emission that still goes into the atmosphere, there's a really important question of, is the community on the ground where that ton is still being emitted into the atmosphere, still dealing with the impacts of that ton in the atmosphere. And so I think expanding our lens to think about what are the non-carbon or non-climate impacts of emissions, or I think in particular, fossil fuel extraction and combustion is really important, because I think we get into a situation a lot of times where we have this idea that carbon removal projects are going to be developed in other communities. And so therefore it's okay for us to, allow some amount of residual emissions into the atmosphere. And that might be true, but I think it's really important that we take a remediation lens to the impacts that are happening to communities. So thinking about their air and water quality, and other community health impacts. So I think it's possible to toe that line, but it's really important that we think about environmental justice for the communities in which the emissions are still being released into the atmosphere. And then I think there's another justice lens, which Mark, I think, also started to touch upon, around are the projects that are being developed in other countries, I think in particularly developing countries or emerging economies, that are they being developed in a way that's giving those communities and those governments and those geographies autonomy and decision-making authority. And so I think it's difficult charting those two things. I think it's possible, but I think we also might get into a situation where we build projects with real environmental justice concerns and build projects that end up polarizing communities against carbon removal.
Thank you so much, Gianna. So we are at time, so I need to wrap up. I think it has been very, very insightful session. I'm happy we had an hour and a half, because that helps to really dig into the topics and get more insights. So we learned on what's happening in the EU front, where I think that the biggest development is still the carbon removal certification framework, and then getting this up and operational with approved methodologies. We heard that in the US there are some very exciting new tools like the CDR Purchase Pilot Prize that's proved popular among the Europeans as something to potentially also apply here in the future. We heard that when we talked about elections that, well, in the EU context, I do agree that it's not clear that too much will change. In the US context, there has been a lot of bipartisan support for different CDR policies. So the support for CDR is durable, as we heard. So I think that's a good takeaway from the session. And yeah, I'll stop here with my summary. We are, I think, by 1 minute over time. So thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you for Carbon Gap for organizing. I think it was a great session. And thank you for all the participants for tuning in and sending in their really good questions. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.